Start tonight off with a little bit of a joke that hopefully leads to what we're doing. So there's these two guys that take the train at Newtonville. They commute into Boston every day. So down the stairs they come every day, right? They see each other on the platform. They don't say anything to each other. They do this for like 3 years without saying anything. Finally, the older guy of the two says, this is ridiculous. So he goes over and he says, listen, I'm Howard. We take the train together every day. There's no reason why we can't get to know each other a little bit and say hello to each other every morning. So, the guy says, I'm Jeff. Great. Nice to meet you. So, the very next day, Jeff sees Howard at the other end of the platform, goes down the stairs, walks all the way down to the end. He goes, Howard, how are you? Howard says, don't ask, he says. But what we want you to do is ask tonight. We want to hear from you. That's what this is all about. So I know we've done some exercises to kind of get the juices flowing. Sorry about that. It was my father-in-law's joke, all right? Sorry. Yeah, exactly. So keep your day job, right? So I do want to recognize some of the elected officials that are here tonight. I think I saw Councilor Albright, Councilor Kelly, Councilor Cody, and Councilor Markowitz. We also have a member of the planning board here tonight. I probably skipped some people. If I did, I'm sorry, but you're all equally important. So tonight we're here to talk about Washington Street. We've been working very closely with the principal group that does this kind of stuff all the time, all over New England. Recently, I think they were in New Bedford, if I'm not mistaken, doing a similar kind of thing. So they're well acquainted with this, and they'll kind of walk us through. I did want to also say that tonight is kind of the beginning of this exercise. We've got an intense week ahead of us. There are postcards on the tables that outline the whole schedule. There'll be some key events, but also drop-in hours. So please feel free to tell your neighbors that couldn't make it tonight. They can stop into the studio at any time and really get a flavor for things and actually see visually what we're talking about. I think that's really one of the neat things that we can do here tonight is because of the many skills that the principal team has, is they can really quickly take an idea and present it visually so you can see it. So without further ado, let me introduce Russ Preston from the principal group.
Thanks, Barney. Good evening, everyone. How many folks came to the launch event a couple weeks ago? Okay, so you all have been oriented. Thanks for coming out on a rainy evening. We have a lot to get through today. This is, like Barney said, this is the beginning of a process. We're going to be at our pop-up studio that we've set up in West Newton for until this time next week, next Tuesday actually, 12th. So you'll have a lot of opportunity to come in and talk with us more and see how things from tonight's discussion evolve and get refined. So a little bit about us. We really get asked by towns and cities throughout New England to come help them think about their future. So, looking at the street today, and then what does it want to be in the future, and how does public space improvements, how do new development, new local businesses, how does all of that fit together? So this is the type of work that we do. But really for us, it's about coming together with the community and working with them hand in hand to shape those plans. So that's why there's a lot of process going on, a lot of people here to help this discussion. But for us, it's really about bringing together a variety of disciplines, everything from engineering to mobility planning, to fiscal impact studies, to economic impact studies. So our team is really diverse as far as skill set, because when you bring up questions, we want to be able to figure out answers for you, or at least start to talk about how we can find answers. So we've got a really diverse set of skills on the team. So come ask us tough questions and let us know what you're thinking, big ideas and your hopes and dreams, so that we can help make that possible. Because really, it comes down to this idea that we can shape our future, and a lot of the times we forget that as humans, because we have zoning, we have sort of comprehensive plans, and we have ways that we have brought ourselves together as a society to to predict the future through regulations. And what we're doing really is talking about what kind of life do we want to have. And does anyone know where that is? I had a similar slide a few weeks ago and no one could guess it. So the point here is that we're really looking to craft places that people actually have meaningful experiences with and places that people love. So how do we do that? For us, it really has to do with bringing together many minds to do that together. So what are we planning? A lot of you saw the maps that were at the last event. Really, it's looking at Washington Street, looking at from essentially West Newton all the way to Newton Corner, and thinking about all the various different characters, all the various different neighborhood centers, the village centers and the main streets, and how do all of those adapt and what are they going to feel like in 10, 15, 20, 30 years. So we've been studying the neighborhood and the physical aspects of all the streets, how these areas connect into the residential streets that are just adjacent or beyond, and how this all kind of ties together really linearly along Washington Street. Parts of it are really a bummer. You know, this is a bus stop, if you can't see the bus stop here. And I pointed this out last time, but it was really worth pointing out again that, you know, from a human's point of view, this is not a very friendly place to spend time. And that's come out of a lot of the feedback we've gotten already. So I'll share some of that with you tonight. And then there's the big sort of elephant in the room, is like, how does Washington Street, and historically it's always been adjacent to this transportation corridor. You know, it was rail in the 1800s, you know, now it's rail and highway. And a lot of you had ideas about, well, how do we put a Band-Aid on this and sort of figure out if air rights and other ideas about how to mitigate the issues of being next to the highway, what are those ideas? And this comes back to the reality that Washington Street has actually adapted over time and has always kind of interacted with different forms of transportation. You know, here's the horse and buggy and the streetcar. But the idea that we can continue to look at it and evolve it to actually improve people's lives, the public life of all of these village centers. You know, sometimes we made poor choices. I'm not sure really what happened here. But this was in vogue. This is sort of fashion at the time. So things can change, and we can actually steer this, and we can create a vision that helps guide all of the folks who make decisions about how places get built. So really what's on the map is important. You know, so if you have ideas about stuff that's on the map or concerns, let us know. And then we're really going to be focusing on, you know, aspects of zoning in an area around the center here, which is really West Newton, Newtonville, and how to understand what's happening around those village centers. So we've started to map this in a variety of other ways, and these will be printed and available at the studio, so you can really look at them in more detail and take them in. So stop by in a couple of days and you can see this whole series. These are just a couple of them, but this one is showing age. So what's interesting is when we started to look at this map, there's really a shift in age as the closer you get to the pike. And actually the age of the resident is younger. You know, so it's kind of an interesting thing happening there from a geography standpoint. This is demographic, and a similar thing, you know, there's these clusters of diversity and various demographic origins and sort of pockets here and there within the neighborhoods, which was interesting. And then, you know, renting versus owning. This map is actually looking at every block and what's the percentage of renter versus owner. And you can start to see as you kind of get towards Newton Corner, there's more renters and less owners. There's more owners on this side, sort of, and then, you know, sort of down towards the south. But you can see some pockets of rental that happen. So kind of interesting trends and sort of looking at this from a geography standpoint. So, you know, the process here tonight is really about starting to test ideas and starting to look at some of the things that we've learned from the launch event and some of the great responses we've got from the community online. But really it's shifting from this idea of what does actually this stuff look like? what are some of these big ideas? What do they actually come together as plans, or as elevations, or as new ideas for parks or open space, or what happens to the street? All of these things are going to start to draw, if we have the energy tonight, likely tomorrow and then on until the next day. But really it's important that you come help us be part of that design process. And why do we do it this way? It's important because we actually want to have a series of conversations with you where we continue to refine ideas and test ideas to get your feedback. So this is very much about drafts and presenting things, and we might not get it right, and you need to tell us that, and so we can make it better. So here we are in the Public Design Week. Really, we think of this as one event in a much longer planning process, but there's so many other events throughout the course of this week that I'll talk about in a second. But what will emerge from this week will come back to the community with later this fall with a draft of both a vision plan and a zoning code. And those will be a first rough draft for the community to have another round of feedback. So the things that we've learned between the design week and that what we're calling an open house, those will come back and share with you as well, so we can continue to get feedback. And then what will happen from this event is we'll have more questions will come up. And we're going to organize a series of topical forums. We don't know what the topics are yet, because we're not at that point in the process. But we'll have another series of meetings that are probably much more specifically focused on topics that emerge as big discussion points. So there'll be another round of feedback there, and then a second draft of both the vision plan and the zoning code, so that the public has another round of input on it. And then the goal on our timeline is to present a draft zoning code to the City Council come April of next year. So that's the process sort of over the course of the year. What's happening this week is really really a few different things. There's kind of 3 levels of interaction you can have with us. This is sort of the easiest. You come, drop by the studio whenever you can when we're open. It says 7 to 12. We're actually going to still be setting up tomorrow. I know it's high school graduation and a lot of stuff's going on in town. Tomorrow's the 6th, yes, sorry. So we're starting tonight. Will not be open tomorrow, then the studio will open on the 7th. Does that make sense? Yeah. So, and then really come by anytime during those time frames, and someone will be there to talk with you, and we can show you what we've been working on. So the next level of this week is the sort of key events. This is one of them, is really kind of getting a big group of people together and having a conversation about these issues. So that's this right now. The next one of these is a more informal key event, but it's really where we're going to literally stop drawing, tape stuff up on the wall, and invite you in to see everything that's still in process. And that's a really exciting time because you'll see a lot of different ideas all in either rough stage or more refined stage, and that's happening on Sunday. There's also a block party, so bring your friends, bring your kids. We want to make sure that this is a fun experience for everyone, because this is talking about your future. It should be fun. So make sure you invite some friends, and we'll have music, fun, and food and games. So from what we hear from this conversation, we'll go back to the studio and do another whole round of design and refinements to ideas and scenarios, and we'll present those to you at what we call the wrap-up presentation. And that's on the 12th at 6 o'clock. That will be a very formal presentation where you'll see what the results of this whole week has created. And then that will be posted online, and we'll get additional feedback on that after this week is over. So, and then this is sort of the most detailed discussion for this week. If you're interested in one of these topics, please write down the time, take a postcard that are outside, and stop by the studio for one of these meetings, and we'll really be able to dive super deep into these topics. So that, the first one is starting at 8:30, Housing, Diversity, and Affordability on the 7th. So make sure to grab a postcard so you have this schedule. So that's sort of the 3 levels of what's happening this week. We were amazed at the community that came out for the launch event. That's why we're in such a huge room tonight. So thank you for telling us that we wanted to have some more space to move around. We listened. But thank you for everyone for coming out. We got an immense amount of input from that experience in that event. So what did we hear? You gave us a lot of notes, and we've been really diving into the details of that. Like this one was really interesting. Not have higher buildings next to the single-family homes. And it was interesting because that came out a couple of times about how the commercial or mixed-use buildings on Washington Street interface with the residential neighborhood. And that's actually one of the most important ideas that a lot of New England communities struggle with is how do you transition between character along the street? And so that's something we want to talk more with everyone about. And this is the transportation map, sort of bike and ped. This was an interesting idea. There's really need more bridges, and then of course trees, which I'll get to in a minute. But the idea that the pike is really this barrier to getting north-south. And the thought has come up a few times is, well, are there places where more bridges, whether they're ped bike or automobile bridges, would that be helpful? And that's a question that's come up a few times. So getting into some of the survey, these are just kind of, we pulled reports from the survey that's still open, so this is just kind of a preview of where things are going with responses. But I thought this was really interesting about the types of public space that people are looking for and curious to have more of. And then this was interesting about dining and socializing. The dark blue is very important. This light blue is important. So then we looked at the public space surveys, these images that you told us you liked at the launch event and online. And we basically said, well, show us the images that more than 75% of the people like or really love these images. And then what's down here is just some analysis of the types of written, the frequency of words. It's a word cloud of how many, what's being said the most about these images. So I wanted to kind of just show you some of these because they're really interesting, the sort of trends that are emerging here. Keep an eye on this color. There's a lot of green that's coming up. A lot of these smaller sort of pocket parks and kind of more intimate spaces were very favorably liked by the community. And then these interesting little pedestrian spaces were highly liked as well. So that was great feedback. And then this idea of this enclosure by trees kept emerging as something folks really liked. Love shady trees. There it is again. So for us, as we kind of pull back and start to look at this, as we organize our neighborhoods, we always forget, we kind of want to talk about buildings first, but it's really the life. What do you want to do in your neighborhood, whether it's on your residential street, walk to the park, or whether it's in the commercial centers that you visit weekly or monthly. But it's the idea that what's the life that has to happen in these places and that we want to happen, and how those spaces support that. So this is kind of the dialogue that we're having, and then this will start to inform the types of buildings that might be around those spaces. And those spaces could be Washington Street or could be others. So the traveling about, this was a really interesting response, which was not surprising to hear this from the community, but then this was one that was kind of at opposition. It's both, safely bicycle to and through Washington Street. So this is the idea that Washington Street is a destination, that people want to go there or maybe spend time. But then this was the response from actually traveling along Washington Street to get to other places. So there's a tension there within the community about, what's the best use for Washington Street. And these two charts kind of brought that together. And it's this idea that, this has always been a transportation corridor. You get streetcars at one point along it. So it's the idea of how do we really support everyone's desires for Washington Street. At the fundamental level, though, it's really comes down to safety. And I wanted to show this slide. You probably have seen something like this before. But even if you're just crossing the sidewalk from your parked car on one side of Washington Street to go get an ice cream cone on the other side of Washington Street, this is an important chart for you. Because if you get hit by a car going above 30 or 40, you're essentially dead. So the idea that we need to control intersection speeds better just to support folks who might be driving to Washington Street anyways is important. So this idea that everyone becomes a pedestrian at some point in their trips around Washington Street and throughout the city is an important aspect to keep in mind. And it's not this. Limited 25 miles per hour. Who is driving 25 miles per hour on a street like that? Right there, okay, good. We have a few people. But the idea that the street actually has to encourage behavior through design. Signage is not part of the design solution. This street was designed to go much, much faster. But this is designed for public scale. And so one of the tests we often have is, can this guy, a little kid, girl or boy, can they run around and can they experience that space in relative comfort? And then you start to introduce the bigger vehicles, the trucks, the bikes, all that. But it's sort of thinking about how that experience happens is so important. There's spaces, we're lucky enough in this region to have spaces that do that, but there's a lot of other ways to do it. And we've been thinking about streets that have characteristics similar to Washington Street, kind of one-sided streets, adjacent to very heavy infrastructure. And this is Commercial Street in Portland, which has a lot of commercial activity along with the waterfront. But the idea that you still want to encourage walking to Main Street scenarios, and how does that, how can there be these focused areas where people and automobiles are one with each other, they behave as good neighbors. And then the idea, bicycling came up a lot, this idea of cycling corridors, and the idea of how do we actually solve the last mile, whether you're taking the bus or you're going to the commuter rail, how do you get from those pieces of commuting infrastructure to your home? And that's a last mile issue. But also just, how do you get to the other amenities that are in Newton easily, perhaps not driving? But it's not just about the person on the bike. It actually is what happens to the street and the businesses that are around that type of infrastructure. And what we've seen in other places is that retail sales actually go up on streets that have been improved in this way and actually been completed by adding bicycling and pedestrian improvements so that all are welcome on the street, not just cars. So we've seen this in a number of places, and it's something to keep in mind as we have a discussion about how improvements of Washington Street can be made. So the fiscal impact, and we're going to study this in more detail, but this is kind of a little bit of an introduction to an idea that cities in New England have a compact development pattern just by their nature and their heritage. So we have to think about, as every square foot of land, what's the best way to use that as part of our community? And what we find is that when we put a lot of parking on land, we're actually really negatively affecting our city, our town, our neighborhood's ability to support ourselves with tax revenue. So what we're finding is that we have to come up with better solutions for how to house our cars so that we can actually build in a form and in a way that actually promotes good, sound fiscal results for our community. And so this was starting to come out in a couple of different ways. Minimize the amount of development that occurs on Washington Street. 39% said not important, 23% said somewhat important. And additional development on Washington Street that generates tax base for the city. It's almost split down the middle. So there's some more discussion we should have on this topic. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce Julie from from Tischler Weiss to talk a little bit more about what a fiscal impact study is.
Thank you. Good evening. Yeah, very, very briefly, I'm happy to be here with you this evening with the firm Tischler Weiss, and we'll really look at what the intersection of land use decisions are with a locality's ability to pay for, provide services and infrastructure. So it really gets down to that direct revenue back to the local government. We're not talking about economic impacts and wealth in the community. We're really talking about tax base, as Russ mentioned. So we really want to understand, and we kind of talk about it in terms of cash flow to the public sector. You think about an economic impact analysis, it's really the cash flow to the private sector on the private side, and there's other benefits that go along with that. But this is really talking about and thinking about what are those direct revenues from taxes and other revenues that are generated from development. And that's typically the easier part of the equation. I mean, that's just kind of simple math to a certain extent. It's the cost side that becomes a little more complex, and that's where we really get into looking at What kind of infrastructure is available currently? Is it usable? Is it sufficient to handle additional development? What kind of services are going to be required to serve that new development? Public safety services, schools, what are those school costs that go along with that? And then at the end of the day, it becomes, are the revenues sufficient to cover the expenditures that are brought about by that particular development? And then have those kinds of discussions about, well, what happens if? What happens if phasing is a little bit, it takes a little bit longer? What happens if there's different mix of land uses? We really get into lots of discussions about the types of things that go into the equation. So the biggies are the revenue structure. Where are you getting your revenue from? Very property tax heavy here, so that's the biggie. The characteristics of that development, if you're talking about multifamily units versus single family units, retail versus office. And on the multifamily side, what are the size of the units? We work in a lot of places that, where we're looking in more detail about size of multifamily units, particularly how it affects and impacts school costs and drives those school costs. And very good data out there these days, and we'll look specifically here, and are looking specifically here to drill down into those characteristics. I mentioned the infrastructure. Is there usable capacity in the roads, on the sidewalks? What else needs to be done? Is it a public responsibility? Is it a private responsibility? Where are those costs, and what are the revenues from it? And then levels of service is really another big key part of this. There's sort of grades on that, but when we talk about levels of services, what is the locality, the municipality doing today? What is that level of service that's being provided in the current budget? What's the public safety situation like? How many officers are on the street? How many kids per classroom? What are those current levels of service? And then what is it going to cost to maintain that level of service? And then there's discussions occasionally on making changes to those levels of service. Are they adequate? Or are they not adequate? And that becomes part of the larger discussion, and a testing on that as well, on that what if. What if we change that level of service? Do we have the revenues to cover those costs? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Julie. So that was a lot and a little, so we're going to be talking about this a few more times this week so we could drill into it more. So that was just kind of a little preview. So the next round of kind of feedback I want to give you is some thoughts on housing. New development along Washington should be more commercial than residential. And that was an interesting response we got here, from not important to somewhat important. So that's sort of an interesting thing to keep in mind around the housing thing and related to Washington Street. And then some other survey results was the importance of housing for family and children, the importance for senior citizens housing, which was very strong, and then this one around low and moderate income housing. So like I said, these surveys are still up. We're going to be having them up for a few more days before the end of the charrette, or before the end of the design week. But on housing, it's this interesting idea to think about in response to families, seniors. What happens in the housing market right now is we're delivering a lot of single-family homes, the sort of detached single-family home, or the sort of apartment building. That's what we're seeing in Boston quite a bit these days and around this region. But what's missing is this middle swath of housing types. These are small apartment buildings, courtyard houses, cottage courts. The types of stuff that we see all over the country 50, 60 years ago that very rarely gets built today. This is sort of a back cottage. It's kind of a starter home. This is a courtyard housing project that has multiple units around the central court. This idea that for folks who are either wanting to stay in their community and age in place, want to get out of their big house and go into something else but not leave their community, it's the idea of going into a cottage versus a large home. And then there's for others who are starting out, want to have their first kid, or want to stay in the community that they've grown to love, go home, to live near their folks. It's the idea of this sort of tiny house, or the idea of this sort of micro loft. Like, all of these are filling gaps in this housing market that are important for families and for young people. So then the other big response, overwhelming response from you all on locally owned stores. Almost everyone agrees on that. And then the idea that more entertainment options and providing eating is important. So yeah, everyone likes to eat. Yes. Which one of these is local? Anyone guess? They're all McDonald's. This is a McDonald's, this is a McDonald's, this is McDonald's. So a lot of this discussion I want to understand better, is it the form that people are reacting to, or is it this commitment to local businesses? So, because we can teach any business to behave. You know, there's regulations, formula business regulations, form-based coding aspects of this. But for us, it's really about how do we actually promote and support small businesses, local businesses, you know, the sort of regional businesses that, you know, have, you know, a lot of folks have fewer than 10 employees. You know, this is small business of America. And it's the difference between the left side of this image and the right side of this image. This is directly how form can actually influence the sort of monthly rent that a small business has. Where you have a big storefront like this, there's not a lot of small local businesses that can support the kind of rent that requires for a month. So it's really important to start to think about this kind of smaller scale rhythm of these storefronts to help support spaces that are the size and of a monthly rent that local businesses can support. So that's sort of the thing we've been seeing in our research around how you actually make places that feel authentic and actually resonate with local businesses. So this gets to the sort of the big discussion that we want to transition to now is, well, how does zoning help this? And one of the overwhelming sort of conversations that emerged out of the launch event over the course of the last few weeks is really, what's the character of Washington Street? And this idea of like, where will development happen? Where could development happen? Where should it not happen? And when you actually go and walk Washington Street from start to finish, you see that there's a lot of different aspects, a lot of different changes of the character. You lose that when you're driving down it. When you're going 45 miles an hour down Washington Street, you don't notice those subtleties. But we've been trying to pay more and more attention to that. And what those subtleties are is something called the transect. So this is a word that we borrow from ecology, is the idea that us as humans, we've actually organized our communities into a series of sort of different characters. You know, some are less intense, have more green, some are more intense, have more uses, more people. But this idea that from the countryside all the way into the center of the city, there are these zones, these transect zones that have very different character. So what we want to understand is, what are those character zones, those districts, character districts within Washington Street, within your neighborhoods, that are important for you now, and where are their boundaries, and what are they made of? So we've started to look at these and started to map these, and you know, the photographs here are sort of, you know, something that we might say is a normal neighborhood residential area. It might be the 3 in there is kind of in this zone, you know, more green, not a lot of businesses, you know, the idea that this is mostly a residential neighborhood. You know, you have mostly single, you know, sort of detached homes like this. When you bring those buildings together, it might look something like this. You know, this is the kind of character you get on a typical block in that type of part of the neighborhood. But then as you kind of go up to the next level of the transect, of this next, you know, what we call character district 4, sort of the general neighborhood. You know, this might be as you're kind of, you know, you turn the corner heading towards Washington Street, you see some, you know, you might see some apartments like this. This is in, I think, Newton Corner. But the idea that you start to get, you know, more apartment buildings, you might get some commercial, some dedicated commercial in there, and that character is built out of these different buildings. And then when you hit the village centers, you know, this is where we're the most confused right now. So this is where we need your input, we need your help. And this is what the activity that sort of the people in the gray shirts have been kind of setting up while I've been talking is, what is the village center's character? And in each village center is likely going to be different, but it really has to do with, you know, looking at a lot of the existing buildings in sort of 1-, 2-story kind of historic fabric. You know, that starts to emerge as this type of character. You know, and there's a variety of things that occur out of that type of character. Then you have this type of character, though, which is also kind of, you know, a commercial center. You know, and it's this type of thing. This is the same scale, the same block that we're drawing this on. So you can see, you know, the sort of finer grain fabric versus the kind of auto-oriented kind of commercial store. And then you actually get some subtlety. You start to get some multi-story buildings. You start to get some residential over retail. So you start to get these buildings that actually are framing the street in more of a way. You start to get this outdoor room. Then what you start to see around the region, around parts of Boston and parts of Newton, is what we're calling a sort of the mixed-use development. At various heights, various characters. But that can start to come together in a character like this. Where parking might be underground, and an interface between these taller buildings and stepping down to the neighborhood, and how this sort of interface is so important when you start to have these types of character coming together. And then you get even sort of another intensity of that, where this is something that we call a podium building, where a lot of these buildings are constructed around parking garages. And you see this a lot in the Boston region right now. And that you start to get block-sized buildings. And you see this a lot in other if you drive around, you see these buildings. Some of these are from this region. But the idea that this kind of development is really about housing cars and surrounding that parking garage with development. And then you get to sort of the highest end of that type of character, which is you're trying to have a main street level scale at the sidewalk level, the 3, 4, 5-story buildings, but then you're getting a shot of density through a point tower. And this is something that allows for more economic benefit to the community and aspects of fiscal impact, but also starts to try and bring together that street life and the sort of important pedestrian human scale environment. That's the type of how those buildings come together. So we kind of went from one end to the other end and sort of said, here's the whole sort of palette of range of what is out there in the market as far as character and what we're seeing as development patterns. What are the right patterns of these types of buildings for parts of Washington Street? And it's very simple. These are buildings that we all know. The shop, the apartment house, the townhouse, and getting into these larger kind of mixed-use buildings. But how do we assemble each of those building types into these character districts? That's something we need your help with. So it's not, this has a profound effect on what results from development. This is sort of one type of building, just kind of built out on a site. But when you start to say we want it to feel more real, more authentic, that's why it's having a variety of types of buildings that have different scales, have an increment of development that makes sense with the neighborhood. You can get really different character. So we can control all this with zoning. So rewriting the zoning to actually arrive at a conclusion around the character that you want, or the character you want to maintain, is the discussion we're beginning tonight. And then, so these are just some examples of those types of zoning documents. So with that, that was a lot, but we really want to dive into this discussion more. So I'm going to ask Lily and Vanessa to come up. And this is going to take a little bit of logistical hurdle, but everyone's been sitting for a while, so we're going to get to stand up, we're going to get to do some stuff, and then we're going to get to talk. So I'll let Lily explain what we're going to do next. Thank you. Oh, I did not. Did everyone enjoy the food? Can we get a big round of applause for all of the Taste of Washington? So hopefully we'll visit all those spaces soon.
Hi, my name is Lily. I'm at the planning team with the City of Newton. Thanks for coming tonight. So again, those vendors that we had tonight, Cabot's, Fiorella's Cucina, Lumiere, Social, Olivia's, Comodore, and Albasha. So it was really delicious and wonderful that they came and volunteered. So as Russ was explaining, we are going to get up in a moment and we're going to be able to walk up and get a close look at some of the things that this team has presented. So some of those character district options, their scenarios. So there's 3 places that are the exact same thing. So this first row here is going to go to the one on the left there that you can see hanging in the windows. This second row here is going to go to the tables back here, which has the character districts. And then the third row in the back is going to also go out the room and go to the right on the far wall. And when you get there, in a moment, you will be handed a pack of the same dots like you saw when you came in, so green and red. And you have 8 of each of them. And you can go up to each of these character district models and put a red dot on it if you don't like it, and a green dot if you do like it. It's really important that you comment on why. Our team will read everything, and the comments are really what helps us understand what it is that you like or don't like. I think that's the gist of this exercise. After that, in about 15 or 20 minutes, we're going to come back in here and sort of have a discussion and a dialogue and a debrief what everyone has been able to absorb and look up at close and personal at the walls. And we'll have further copies in hand at the table discussions. Yes, and we will turn the lights on. Yes. Yes, so the group discussions, you'll come back here, we'll come and grab you in about 20 minutes. Thank you.